We are here tonight at the store to listen to Nadine Epstein talk about her new book, Elie Wiesel, An Extraordinary Life and Legacy. Epstein is an award-winning journalist, founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change, and a founder of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Journalism Initiative. In addition, since first joining in 2004, she has served as editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine, the landmark periodical for the American Jewish community, co-founded in 1975 by Elie Wiesel. In addition to writing the numerous books he's famous for, such as his landmark Night trilogy, and receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1986, Wiesel was a mentor for Epstein when she took over the magazine, and in tribute to him, she has compiled this book, which is a testament to the many lives he's affected in addition to Epstein's own. The book presents Wiesel's biography through text and pictures, showcases his own essays and speeches, and collects reminiscences from all manner of public figures, friends, and colleagues to reflect on the profound impact Wiesel has had on this earth. Joining Epstein tonight in conversation will be Robert Siegel, host of NPR's All Things Considered from 1987 until his retirement in January of 2018, not to mention the winner of the 2013 Moment Magazine Creativity Award. So please help me welcome them both to Politics and Prose.
Thank you. Thank you. Is my mic on?
Yes. Is mine on too?
Yes.
Great.
Good. Hiya.
Hi.
I should explain that one of the things I do in retirement is I contribute to Moment magazine. And when I'm asked by those who are unfamiliar with it, what is that? I invariably mention two names. One is it was co-founded by Elie Wiesel. And the other is it's edited by Nadine Epstein, who does a great job and whom I've enjoyed working for very part-time over the past.
And he's in this current issue, actually writing about Proust.
That's right, my present obsession. I'm here to talk about both with Nadine about Wiesel, and I couldn't imagine someone more appropriate to ask about him. First, I want you to explain his connection to Moment. And what I didn't know, that Moment, the name Moment, actually had special resonance for Wiesel.
So the first time I met him, he explained it to me. It's from Der Moment. Der Moment was a newspaper in Warsaw, a daily Yiddish paper from 1910 to 1939. And actually its editor and its editor's son were both killed by the Nazis in the next year or two after it was forced to close. But it was a famous independent paper, and Elie Wiesel saw it when he was a little boy in his home in Sighet in Romania. His father read it, but he never touched it because he was a yeshiva boy, and yeshiva boys didn't touch newspapers. Yep.
They were treif.
They were treif. So later on in his life, when he decided to become a journalist, or he needed to do something different because he wasn't going to be following a religious path in his life, he thought about Der Moment, and he thought, well, I'm going to be a journalist. And then later on, when he was going to have a magazine, which he co-founded, by the way, with Leonard Fine, who was very important to the founding of the magazine, he then decided to call it Der Moment. So Moment is actually a legacy publication. So.
And in addition to the remembrances of him by other people, essays about him, some of his most important speeches, an interview that you did with him, there are also a couple of essays he wrote for Moment, included in the book.
In the beginning, he actually wrote for Moment, although he often wrote in French, and you can see that they're all translated from French because he liked to write in French and he didn't like to write in English. But later on, when I took over the magazine and said, hey, don't you want to write some stories for us? He said, well, writing's such hard work. I'd much rather you interview me, and I just started interviewing him. So
today, let's say a young person reads Night. That person reads that book in the context of a world in which there are any number of memoirs about the Holocaust, in which there have been movies, there have been plays, it's been widely treated. Put us back into the 1950s, into the post-war years, when it really wasn't that common.
So nobody wrote about, he didn't want to talk about anything that happened to him after it happened to him. So he didn't want to write about it. So he actually met Francois Mauriac, who was a Nobel Prize literature winner in France, and he talked him into writing about it. But when I was growing up, nobody, I don't know, other people my age, but we certainly didn't talk about the Holocaust. we knew lots of our family members had died, but we just didn't talk about how or why. Now, we didn't buy anything made from Germans at all, but we didn't actually explain why we didn't buy anything made in Germans in my household. But really, people just didn't read books about the Holocaust. There were very few. There was, what? Excuse me? Oh, I'm so sorry. So, anyways, what was I saying?
Well, that people in those days didn't write, or frankly didn't talk a lot about the experience.
No, they didn't. So actually Elie was very, very important in getting people to speak about and write about the Holocaust, because once he did, he started teaching at City University of New York, and a lot of children of Holocaust survivors came to see him and take his classes. They were all kind of drawn to him. He was like a magnet for these children of Holocaust survivors, and he encouraged them to write their stories and write their parents' stories and have their parents write their stories. So he was very important. And if you look at a lot of the books that are about the Holocaust, now we have like a whole world of books about the Holocaust, which are so incredibly important, I think. You'll see that he actually blurbed a lot of them. Mm-hmm. He was very generous with his blurbs. You could call up Elie and say, I have this book and it's about my mother. And he didn't know you at all, but he often would agree to just write a blurb, and his name was like gold in the publishing world.
One of the things I learned writing for you this year and reading for you was when I read the enormous biography of Saul Bellow that came out. Bellow recalled a friend of his, I believe it was Lionel Tiger, the writer, who was at the movies with his mother in 1940, whatever, when a newsreel came on, and I think it was of the liberation of Buchenwald. And his mother's reaction was, "We'll never live this down. This disgrace, this is unbearable. The disgrace of the Jewish people, that they were reduced to this in the camps." And it's an attitude that seems so from a different age right now. And I think Elie Wiesel is one of the people who crosses that line, who takes us out of that land of shame into describing what happened.
I think he describes the evil is beyond him. It's beyond the Jews. It's really this incredible evil that he experienced, and I think that's also what gave him his moral gravitas and his moral authority. But yes.
His Night, his memoir of the Holocaust and of being deported to the camp, it is now a short. We think of it as a short novel. Yes. It was not always a short book.
No. So it started out. So Francois Mauriac suggests he writes this book, and then he agrees to. So he goes. He's a journalist. So he's a foreign correspondent, and he goes to Latin America, and he takes a boat. And it's a long, long boat ride. So he starts writing, and he writes, 1,400, 1,500 pages in Yiddish. And then he publishes this book. It's hard to get a publisher. He finds a publisher who's in Latin America, and the book gets published. And then he takes this long manuscript back to Francois Mauriac, and he goes, it's way too long. So he shortens it, and he writes it in French. And then later on, it becomes this 110-page book in English. And I'm always amused by, or maybe not amused is the wrong word, but there's people who go, his story changed over the period, or while he was writing it. He said something different in Yiddish than he did in English or in French. And I'm like, first of all, just think about this incredible experience that this man went through. And he was a teenager, he was a young kid. It takes a while to be able to tell a story the way you want to tell a story, or to even figure out what you want to say. And the fact that there are different drafts of this novel in different languages, he finally comes to this 110 pages that's really spare, that's really beautiful, and says things in the way he wants to say. And I think in the process, he's learned how to be a writer, a real writer, and he is a real writer. And he chooses his words very carefully. I mean, he really cares about words, which is why later on when I said, don't you want to write lots of stories for us? He was like, no, it's too much work. Although he did write every day, and he was incredibly prolific.
You've just mentioned in passing the different languages that he wrote. And let's deal first with the Wiesel and languages. He grows up in Transylvania, which was a Hungarian-speaking part of Romania, I believe. Yiddish is the language of his household. He's a young Hebrew scholar as a teenager. French, where does French enter the picture?
So I know that I don't know if he knew French when he was a young boy or not. I know that his Hebrew was so good that when he went to Israel later on, like when he's like 19 years old, he really speaks Hebrew basically fluently. He doesn't really have to learn any more Hebrew. I don't know if he learned French when he was a little kid, but obviously he goes to a small village or town in France after the war with other orphans, and he must have, certainly then, and then he goes to the Sorbonne, so he becomes fluent in French, and for his whole life after that, he writes in French. He's very French. He was very French. And seemed very French to me. He's very cosmopolitan. He had that French look for him. I mean, it's like he absorbed a lot of, like he was in Paris and France at a time in his life when he's just really, it's really a formative period. And you can see in the photos in the book how he's just become so European.
And I think you asked him, what language do you think in? Was that your question, or was that another interview? And he said, it depends what I'm thinking about.
I did.
But if it's about philosophy and literature, it's French.
I think I asked him that. Yeah.
There are many interesting remembrances of him in the book. One of them that I found especially interesting is by the Israeli journalist Nahum Barnea, whom I met once, interviewed a few times on NPR. And Barnea used to, he would tell Wiesel, which raises an important question. Why don't you, first of all, why don't you ever criticize Israel, is one of the questions. And Wiesel says, well, because I don't live there.
Yeah.
Barnea's answer is, why don't you come and live there? Why don't you come and live there? You could improve the place if you came there.
If you came there, you could criticize it. That's what he's saying.
And he, the man with the mind of a French philosopher, chooses New York instead. That's where he lives for all these years. So first of all, what was his relationship with Israel, which he fiercely defended all the time?
So he goes to Israel when he's, I guess, like 19. There's a picture of him. It looks like he's a teenager. He's a very sad-looking teenager, and he's on this boat called the Nagba, and he has an assignment to go write about the migrants from all over the world coming to Israel, including the Holocaust survivors. And he goes there and he stays for 3 months and he visits all these different camps, the migrant camps. And I think it was Nahum and a couple other people I talked to, because I never talked to him about this. He doesn't like what he sees, and he's supposed to be writing this series, and he never publishes the series. But he goes and travels around Israel and has, a good time in Israel. But somewhere in there, he just decided he didn't want to live in Israel, and he wanted to live in New York. And so he always had that line, which is, I think, a line which many other people have. He's not the only one who says that. But he, I was going to say, I forgot what I was going to say.
Well, the line that he drew about not living there and.
I know. He was a very nuanced person, and he was really curious, and he loved talking to Nahum Barnea, and they would have big conversations about politics in Israel, and they were very nuanced conversations. But he was also very discreet and didn't have those conversations in public. But to ever think that he was an ideologue about Israel would have been a mistake, because he was close friends with Yitzhak Rabin. He was friends with various leaders of Israel from right to left, and he did the same thing here in the United States. So he wasn't an ideologue at all. He was very cosmopolitan, very nuanced person. Also discreet, which is something that we don't have much of anymore. But
I anchored NPR's live broadcast of the official opening of the Holocaust Memorial. In my memory, it's strangely connected to the events at Waco, because I ducked out of having to cover Waco because I said I've got to go get a tour of the museum. Sorry. Anyway, he was the speaker. Ted Koppel was the MC of the event, and Elie Wiesel spoke. And he, I think at that point, addressed, if not directly, implicitly in his words, a central question about the Holocaust, about memorializing the Holocaust, studying the Holocaust, which is the balance between dealing with the specific events that befell the Jews between 1930 whatever and 1940 whatever, and the broader question of genocide and mass killings and horrible abuses of power. How did he How did he draw that line?
Well, he was a particularist. He cared a lot about Jews, and he thought the Holocaust was unique, a unique descent into evil. But he also was a universalist, and he cared about all kinds of suffering. And I think he took that, what he learned from the Holocaust and having seen people, the silence that occurred and the indifference that occurred to the Jews during the Holocaust, and he didn't want to see that repeated anywhere else in the world. And he was very active, about Darfur and Rwanda and Cambodia. I mean, he cared deeply, and Bosnia. And there's a wonderful picture of him in the book where he's wearing a flak jacket. He's not a young man, and he's out there, he was actually traveled around the world as a foreign correspondent when he was a young man. He put himself in danger, but he's there in Bosnia right after the war. So he cared a great deal about that, and I think that was really important to his students. We interviewed a young woman who was who's a Palestinian American who he inspired to become a Palestinian activist in the book. We were talking about, Sonari Galinton is in the book, who used to work at NPR, but he was one of his students, and he inspired him to become a journalist and to be himself, which was not so easy when he was a young student at Boston University as a rare African-American student at the time when he went to school at Boston University. So I think he was always, and including me, he always inspired me, he always encouraged me to be myself and find my own voice. It was something that he did. He really, I think, cared about what people, he wanted you to find out who you were, in addition to caring about, I guess, your bigger question here, right, which was the other genocides of the world.
Yeah, but actually the young woman you mentioned, the Palestinian American who became an activist, she wasn't encouraged by him explicitly to plead the Palestinian cause,
no,
but his example led her to become an advocate for that cause.
Absolutely. And I think when you talk to some of his students, you find that a lot of his students were inspired to do different things that he might not have personally done, but that they were important to them and they believed in, and that was,
There's a question that runs through his writing and that runs through public discussion of Elie Wiesel, which is his faith. And how did his faith survive this experience? And it's one that he addressed in writing and one that he talked about. How would you describe his attitude?
So I'm not sure his faith survived. I mean, of course, Judaism at its heart, in one way of looking at it, is wrestling with God, and I think he continued to wrestle with God. I think obviously in Night, and we have here in the beginning of the book, the memorial, the famous quote.
But the night that
Do you know the
seven.
Hold on a second. Yeah, I think this says a lot. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in the camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. And I'll go on to, never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. So he chose still, from my understanding and from my conversations with him, to be an observant Jew. And he didn't necessarily have the faith that he had before. And as a young boy, he had incredible faith. I mean, he was so observant. He was, all he read was the Talmud and the Torah, and he was studying the Kabbalah at an early age, a way too early age to be studying the Kabbalah. That was his, he was such a believer, more than I think most people are believers at that age. For him, the fall from God was a big fall. But he does, when, he went to an Orthodox synagogue for his whole life, and he loved the liturgy. He loved, he knew all the prayers. He grew up in that world. He loved the music. He loved to sing. He loved to sing the liturgy. He was observant, but he didn't necessarily believe.
So several people remark on the fact that he sang Hasidic tunes very well. He evidently was gifted
He had a really lovely voice. So after the war, when he goes to Paris, he actually runs a Jewish children's choir. He's a choir master. So, he knows his music, and he did some performing at the 92nd Street Y. There's like a little clip on the web somewhere of him singing. He actually did a little bit of composing with someone else who's in the book. So he really loved music, and he really was very musical. In my imagination, I have no idea if this is true. He would have been, someone who sang in the synagogue. Like that would have been like his career.
You mean had there been?
Had there been no, yeah, he would have been a yeshiva teacher and scholar, and he would have sang. As it turns out, he did sing in the Fifth Avenue Synagogue all the time with Cantor Malavenu, who's in the book, because they loved singing, and he was a regular, and he did a lot of the singing. So.
There are remarks in some of the remembrances that are implicit criticisms of some things that Elie Wiesel did, but this is not it's very much a tribute to the man of the book. Did you find yourself in editing it and in collecting all this saying, am I obligated to air other criticisms of him? Should I try to be more dispassionate, or this is a great man, we should be passionate about him?
So I think there's a pretty wide spectrum here of people who have different points of view. You can tell by reading Bernard-Henri Lévy that he doesn't think Elie's the greatest writer in the world. You can tell...
Three guesses who he thinks is the greatest writer.
I would guess, okay. There are people in here. There's another person. You could tell that the only thing that she could find that she really wanted to say was that he was a really interesting Yiddish scholar. I mean, there is a spectrum of people in this book that are interviewed who are, not his wildest admirers. So one of the things he always told me about the magazine is that, because we have opinions from all, pretty wide spectrum, and he would always say that, I love that. I love the tumult, and I love the tumult of Jewish thought, and I love that that's in the magazine, but I also love that it's really tasteful, and and that it's civil. So I guess that's what I always do with the magazine, and that's what I did with the book. I speaking a lot of places about the book. There are people who come up and tell me amazing stories that I wish I could have put in the book. I just met somebody even here earlier before we started talking about that. But I also meet people who, I wish I'd been in the book. I hated Elie. And had have all sorts of reasons things. So, I mean, he was a human being, and there were people who liked him, and there are people who love him, and there are people who admire him, and he has detractors as well. So I try to include a wide spectrum of voices, but, I don't have the woman who has accused him of sexual harassment in the book, for example. It didn't seem like it fit in the book. So, yes, I did make some choices there.
In a moment, we'll take questions from our guests. I guess I'd like to hear though first your sense of do you think that 50 years from now, people will be reading Elie Wiesel? Will he be the president, the fabled president of my university, Grayson Kirk, the longtime president of Columbia University? How many people remember him? That's a lot. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. So lots of people win Nobel Peace Prizes and fade from our memories.
It's a great question. So what he won the Nobel Peace Prize for, really, I think was it came out of standing up to Ronald Reagan about Bitburg. That's when it occurred a year later. But I would say that he has something that most Nobel Peace Prize winners don't have, which is the book Night. And the book Night is really where is like an incredible glimpse into the world, his experience, and it's experience we all need to read. And it's one of the things I think about. It's really powerful and important for young people, because it's a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old kid writing this, and it's in that voice. And it speaks to young people. And I think it may not be as understandable to young people 50 years from now, because maybe they won't have the historical grounding that we have now. Or hopefully they will, but it will still speak to them directly. So I think that book is his other work is also important, but that book is really what makes him so important for us, for the future.
I suppose it's noteworthy and germane to what Elie Wiesel did, that before him, the iconic book, I shouldn't use that word, but the most popular book about the Holocaust was the book about a young girl dying, Anne Frank. This is the story of a teenager surviving, and it was it's a big difference.
I never actually thought about it in that way. It's the book that I read. The only book I read about the Holocaust as a young person was Diary of Anne Frank, and it was a very powerful book, but it didn't bring you into the camps, first of all, and his book, which I didn't read till I was older, brought you directly into the camps. And so it was a different kind of experience. It was a different kind of Holocaust in a way. I was talking to someone yesterday about the difference between survivors and refugees. So, there are many people who escaped the Holocaust, and Anne Frank wasn't one of those, who have written about it. They had these journeys to escape, but there are other people who were actually survived the camps. And those stories, I think, are particularly powerful. Elie's story is not the only one. Primo Levi is important. I found Viktor Frankl. I don't know how many of you read Viktor Frankl. That book was incredible as well. But yes, it's really. I feel like maybe the answer to this is that you need to read a group of them. So for the students and kids 50 years from now, maybe we should design, here's 5 books you should read. Because they're not going to be reading all the books, but maybe we have to figure out which ones are the most important and tell different parts of the story.
Well, let's take questions.
Can I say one thing?
Yes, sure.
Is that today is does everyone know what a yahrzeit is? Yeah. Today is actually Elie's yahrzeit. He died in the lunar calendar 3 years ago today, which I didn't realize when this date got set up. In fact, I only realized that this morning, so I just wanted to share that all with you.
Cool. Light a candle. Yes.
We should all light a candle.
Let's take questions. Yes.
First, I'd like to say that I've never seen you before, but your voice is as familiar to me as my family's voices. I listen to you every day. I pictured you as younger, to tell you the truth.
As what?
Younger.
As younger, yeah.
He is younger.
I used to be younger.
2 questions. How did Elie Wiesel get from the camps to Paris? From a Herbacher who, didn't speak French, was in Romania. There must have been something in between.
So basically, I'm sure he went to a displacement camp, but
Right.
the children, orphans, who were under a certain age, were all sent to they weren't allowed to be sent to cities. I guess they went to, they basically went to like an orphanage in France that was set up for Jewish kids who had survived the Holocaust. So he went there, and then somehow an article gets written about him about the orphans, and his pictures in the newspaper. And one of his sisters, 2 of his sisters survive, and one of them sees it in the newspaper, and then he goes. His sister, that sister's in Paris, and another sister is somewhere else. So they're all reunited.
And one other question. What did he think of the people who did nothing? That was everybody. That was Evian. Hitler offered to give all the Jews away if someone would take them. And I think there was one country in the Caribbean that would. We did not.
Yeah, I don't know if the mic is live, but the question was, what did he think about the people who did nothing? The countries like our own that did not accept refugees from Germany. I think he would have called that the sin of indifference. Yes?
Yeah. But it still goes on.
Well, he cared. He obviously cared a great deal about refugees, and so if the question is, what would he think today? That's a great question. It's one I think about a lot. I actually think, and I just was writing about this the other day, that, well, on one hand, I'm glad he didn't have to see all what's happening right now in our country. On the other hand, he was one of the few people who actually had a voice that might have commanded some respect of this administration. He had moral authority that most of us don't have, although, as he would tell me, you have more than you think, and don't say, because I would sometimes say to him, well, but I'll never, you have such moral authority, and he would say, no, we all have moral authority. But he would have, I forgot what he was saying.
Oh, well, I think
that's enough.
You've answered the question. Thank you. Gentlemen here, I think you'll either have to come to the mic. Oh, no, there's a microphone here.
Hi. You said that, Nadine, you said that he, these days, did not speak publicly about Israel. But has he said anything to you privately or personally, either in dismay or delight, about Israel today? Or maybe to rephrase it, can you speculate what he might think or say about, either in dismay or delight, about Israel today?
So I think I said that he talked to people on all sides, and I know one of the reasons from talking to Nahum Barnea that they talked about politics in Israel quite frankly, and again, conversations with Elie were much more nuanced than they might have been in public. So private conversations were. I guess the answer is towards the end of his life, I think you might remember that he went to see Netanyahu speak at the Congress, really, and I'm not sure. Again, I think he was.
This was the invitation that bypassed the Obama administration.
Bypassed the Obama administration, for which afterwards many of my friends, some of them here, said, "Oh my God, he's terrible. How could you? You should close the magazine. It's so terrible that he did that." I was like, well, first of all, he was a very old man, and I don't really think that. I'm not sure at the end, if you knew him, that he was quite the man he was earlier. But throughout his life, I thought he did a really good job of actually being very diplomatic and trying to remain a friend of Israel, but, also have conversations. And he knew what was going on. He understood. He was a very curious man. He talked to everybody on all sides of things, within a spectrum, not maybe on the extremes.
I should add here, by the way, that Nahum Barnea, who was a great columnist for Yediot Achronot, the newspaper that years earlier Wiesel had been a reporter for, a correspondent for you.
He was. In fact, he goes to Israel that first trip when he's like 19 years old, and he doesn't write that story about the migrants coming to camps there, because he doesn't like how he sees Holocaust survivors being treated. And then he gets a job working for Yediot Ahronot. And that's why he comes to New York eventually, because he's the UN correspondent. He gets sent here, and he moves to New York. He doesn't really know very many people. He doesn't really have much money. He's kind of a lost soul. He gets here, by the way, gets hit by a cab in Times Square, almost dies.
Writes a novel about it. Yeah. He starts writing novels about things as opposed to writing, later on he gets back to memoirs. But he covers the UN for this Israeli newspaper. And he told me that he always read Yediot Ahronot. He always read Hebrew newspapers. And he always read that paper all the time. But the point I would just add is that while Barnea was a very interesting journalist, and who also lost a son in one of the bus bombings in the number 18 bus many years ago, yes. He's a very interesting guy, but he's by no means the only Israeli you interview, or who contributes here. One of them is Danny Danon, who is the Israeli ambassador to the UN and came out of running the Settlers Council,
the Yesha
Council of settlements on the West Bank, and used to be Gaza, but not anymore. So it's some array of voices from Israel that you hear from there.
I try to include different people who. Again, so there's a big difference between where Danny Danon is coming from and where Nahum Barnea is coming from. And
see where our next question is coming from.
Here?
Yes.
I was surprised when I heard the news that he had died, and I went to Wikipedia, and the deniers had already pasted all sorts of stuff that, in actuality,
He wasn't even really alive.
Yeah, well,
right?
they locked his Wikipedia entry about 18 minutes after he died because there was so much of the hate groups, the good people on the other side, who were posting stuff. If Wiesel wanted to be remembered in a single thought, how would you paraphrase his life? How would he have wanted to be remembered?
Well, I can't answer that in a simple way, except that I was recently on a panel with Ariel Berger, who wrote a beautiful book called Witness and he was one of his students and a teaching assistant, and he talked about how Elie wanted to be remembered as a teacher, most important as a teacher. Now, when I had conversations with Elie, well, I'm a writer, and we talked about writing, and he told me he wanted to be remembered first and foremost as a writer. So I can't begin to say what Elie would say to everyone about, or how anyone would answer that question, but obviously on different days and different. But I'm sure, to be serious, that he would want to be remembered as someone who spoke out to evil, spoke out against indifference. I imagine that's, and was a witness to evil and took that message beyond. I hope I would imagine that's how he'd want to be remembered.
A question here.
This is a little bit personal. I'm very curious as to how you encountered one another and how this amazing professional and personal relationship developed and evolved.
It's a great question. So kind of just in the randomness of the universe, I ended up taking over Moment magazine. And I wasn't really a person, I didn't have any particular involvement in the Jewish world. I didn't know who anybody was, but I did know who Elie Wiesel was. But I didn't really know who anybody else was in the Jewish world outside my hometown. And I knew there were two founders, and so they both were living in Boston, and I got on the Amtrak, and I went up there, and I had dinner with Leonard Fine, and then I went to see Elie in his office. And just like, as if I was and many people could make appointments to go see Elie, and I was just one of those people who made an appointment to go see him. And he kind of pops up from behind his desk, and it's this beautiful office. It's got books everywhere. It's, very spacious. It's got, books lined everywhere. It's just, it's what you would imagine his office would be. His other offices weren't quite as nice, but this one was pretty gorgeous. So I was just tongue-tied, by the way, because to me, I kept looking at him, and he was like, all I could think about was the boy in Night. I couldn't see him as a human being. I just saw him as a character in a book, and I just couldn't get beyond that. And he was very, very nice, and he kept saying, "What can I do for you?" And the other thing that was really hard is that he spoke so softly. This is not a man who spoke loudly at all. On paper, yes, but in voice, no. And he had such a thick accent, and I could barely understand him. And I kept going, "Could you say that again?" And he would just ignore me and I learned very quickly that you don't say that to Elie Wiesel. You don't say hi. He just kept talking. So I didn't even get everything that he said. It took me a while to get used to his voice. So I would go and see him. We talked on the phone. It took me a while to get over just being so tongue-tied in his presence and to be able to see him as a person. And part of that was because, again, I remember I knew him in the later part of his life, and he was just, as he was aging, and it was very sweet time in a way to get to know him and to be able to spend time with him.
Thank you.
One of the sadder parts of the end of his life was he was one of the most, I guess after Sandy Koufax, he was the second most famous loser with Madoff, with Bernie Madoff and his money. Lost a lot of money with him. And an old friend and colleague of mine, Kati Marton,
who's in the book,
writes in the book about asking him, Kati, Jewish by ancestry, but that was something she hadn't learned until she was well into adulthood. She wondered wasn't it what a shame, that how could a Jew have done this to you? And his answer was essentially, well, the he was a crook. There were Jewish crooks too. It seems to
Yeah.
be. That's
Yeah, and he did really. I think he lost money personally, and his foundation lost money. But on the upside of that, so many people came together to help the foundation once it lost money, including me. I mean, all sorts of people gave money to Elie and to the foundation. To the foundation, at least, that the foundation didn't stop doing anything. All of its projects, as far as I understand, continued. But I think it did impact his life, his own personal life a bit.
someone was raising a hand.
Oh, and there's somebody in the middle too.
Yes.
It's hard to go into the mic there.
You can shout.
In the 30 years between winning the prize and his death, did he ever say the Nobel Peace Prize before that he always had been a great man?
The question was, in the 30 years between his winning the Nobel Peace Prize and his death, did he ever say that winning the prize had been a burden?
Well, I never heard him say that, and maybe he said that to somebody, else. But I would never see. But to me, I think winning the Nobel Peace Prize put him into a world of. I mean, he'd become a real public figure when he becomes the chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Commission, which is Stu Eisenstadt. Recommends him to Jimmy Carter to do that, and then I think getting the Nobel Peace Prize launched him to a world of where he had incredible influence, and I never got the impression that he didn't like having that incredible influence. So I think at some point, he had some security. I mean, I'm sure it was not fun to be like have Holocaust deniers and have, he had a lot of security at a certain point, but I don't think that had anything to do with having won the Nobel Peace Prize.
In fact, after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the fact that he never learned to drive ceased to be a problem for him.
Yes. By the way, you can see in the book, so again, in the beginning we were only just going to have like one picture of Elie on the cover, and then this turns into like this book with more than 100 photos because the expressions on his face tell a story. You see when he's a young man and he's a teenager and he's a kid, there's just not a lot of smiling going on here. He looks haunted. And then as he gets older, he's much happier, and he has I picked photos with beautiful smiles where he's getting the Congressional Medal from Ronald Reagan, and also when he looks like so incredibly happy getting the Nobel Peace Prize. So.
We have two questions. First here, and then we'll go to that, Mike.
I just want to offer one comment and ask a question. I interviewed him once in Miami when I was writing for the newspapers down there, and I can still remember almost like a mist of suffering that surrounded the man.
When did you interview him?
About 82, 83.
Really? Okay.
And a question also: what was Elie's comment with the treatment of the Arabs in Israel and the whole Arab-Israel situation?
Well, let me answer the first one first, which I think I can answer a little bit better. I mean, in my experience, he's somebody who did not fall into. He managed to, for the grace of life, and strengthen himself, not fall into the abyss of despair, and actually transcend that, and I think to become a pretty functional man and grown up, who, when I talked to him, didn't seem like a man who was despairing. And in fact, something I don't know if I put it in the book, but he always had this mischievous twinkle in his eye, which I found to be quite charming. And he was very gracious, and he was more concerned, like every time I would see him, he'd go, "What can I do for you?" He was always so gracious, and he just didn't seem depressed. I know that I saw one part of him, but I don't think that in his latter part of his life that was as much something that I experienced.
Thank you. And sir.
Yeah, was he troubled at all by what is in some circles the de-emphasizing of the Holocaust? For example, at my college, there were people who referred to the Holocaust as white-on-white crime. Did he run into anything like that? And if so, how did he deal with it?
I don't know what he would say about white on white crime. I mean, that's
Brown collar crime.
brown.
Would be.
Yeah, I don't know, but I do know that I think he would have always argued and always was very clear that the Holocaust was a very unique experience and a particular kind of evil. And I'm quite sure that he wouldn't have wanted to hear it described as white on white crime. I think that would diminish its power. So.
But was he? I mean, he was obviously confronted with the denial. I mean, with the Holocaust deniers, with people complaining that they have more immediate concerns to worry about than the murder of 6 million Jews 70 years ago. Did he seem to encounter that idea?
So I wasn't traveling around with Elie in his pocket. So I have to, I was having certain kinds of conversations with Elie. Right. So I'm only speculating here, really, about whether that would be.
Here, we have a question here.
I don't know how to get. Anyway.
Can someone? You could even bend it.
Come here. I'll give you. Can use mine.
Okay, let's just.
Here, come here. We can share the mic. You can stay right
here. Okay.
I just came from the mall searching for the Folklife Festival, which wasn't possible. I've always had the greatest respect and love for Elie Wiesel. And as someone who personally has a deep love for Israel, Ahavat Israel, which is very ingrained in me, I did read a long time ago that in his Nobel acceptance speech, he mentioned the Palestinians. And as someone who has been active in that area, and I apologize if you've touched on this, I once went to a speech of his that was entitled at GW, Building a Moral Society. And I brought up the treatment of Palestinians, and I said, you've been the moral voice of your time. You've stood at the Thai-Cambodian border and said the death of a people is near, and he supported the sanctuary movement, and I asked him to speak out. I kind of implored him and gave examples. And his answer, and I taped it and wrote to him after, his answer was, that's one of the toughest questions, and he goes to Israel once a year, and he must have proof. I sent him a photo, and I'll stop. I sent him a photo of an Israeli soldier with his foot on the neck of a Palestinian. So anyway, so I have concluded that he couldn't go further than mentioning them because Israel and the Jewish people were his family. And I've thought a lot about that.
So again, from my understanding, he was someone who definitely supported a two-state solution. He was a very cosmopolitan, and again, he was a sophisticated person in the world. I think he made this decision at one point in his life that this was not going to be an issue that he was going to be able to speak out on. Although I think he spoke about it personally, privately, with a number of people. There are people I know on the right who are very angry at Elie because he never went to live in Israel. And
where he was offered the presidency.
He was offered the presidency once. He turned down the presidency. He and Albert Einstein both turned down the presidency of Israel, by the way. But he never, he made a clear decision not to go there, move there, but he always visited one time a year. And I think his family is continuing to do that now. On the other hand, there are people I know on the left who are just horrified till this moment that he went and showed up at the Congress when Netanyahu was speaking, when Obama didn't invite him to do that, come. So, but then I also know that he was a big admirer of Obama, and that he spoke with Obama all the time, often. So I guess he was a man who tried to, use his moral authority in the ways that he felt that he could be most effective, and he also, again, was a man of great civility and tastefulness. And I think that there were places where he just didn't want to go. He just couldn't go.
one measure I felt in reading the book of what a Jewish guy to his bones Elie Wiesel was when his son is interviewed and is asked, what did your father regard as the greatest danger to the Jewish people? And as you're waiting for, the nuclear strike from Iran or the climate change that leads to complete desertification, and it was intermarriage was the greatest threat to the Jew. And he said, I don't care if people convert or they're born Jewish, but marrying out, that was the greatest threat to the Jewish people.
So imagine how hard it must have been to be Elie Wiesel's son. And Elie has a son, which he wasn't in a way ever, I guess, apparently thinking about having children, but he ends up deciding to have children, and he has this son who becomes a real rebel and goes to college and comes back home with a blue dyed mohawk. And you can just imagine, you've got Elie Wiesel.
He was coming in from Yale, we should say.
Okay, he was coming from Yale, yeah. But still, Elie was very, very refined and always, looked great. I mean, his hair was always wild, but he was, But anyways, and he told his son, he said, look, you can do whatever you want in the world. You can be anything you want to be in the world. I only ask one thing of you. That is that you marry Jewish. And the reason being is because he wanted that continuity. It was in honor of his parents and his sister who had been killed in the Holocaust. And Elisha does do that. Elisha is now CFO, or I think maybe vice president now of Goldman Sachs. So he's no longer the rebel that he once was. And he wears nice, natty little suits and things like that. But anyways, and there's a really funny story. So I only had one personal connection with Elie Wiesel growing up, So my mom was executive director of a Jewish community center in my hometown of New Jersey. And the Wiesels used to come and spend the summer there for a while. I mean, I never met them. I didn't know them at all. But apparently, Marianne Wiesel calls my mom once and says, hi, I have my son. I want to send him to camp. What should I do with him this summer? And my mom had just started a computer camp. And she said, send him to computer camp. And Marianne Wiesel said, okay. And then it turns out he goes to computer camp. He's a computer guy. He's like IT. He's totally computers. That's what his whole career has been. So my mom had something to do with it. Maybe.
Are there other questions from the audience, either from someone at a microphone or with a good, solid pair of lungs who would like to? Well, in that case, is there something that I haven't asked you here that you want to say before you get to signing books in a serious way?
I guess only that I think it's, again, I wish, part of me wishes Elie was around today so that he could stand up to some of the shenanigans we see going on. But we can take some lessons from him and remember, of course, not to be indifferent to evil. We can also remember to learn from other people and to listen to other people and to speak graciously and with civility, but still stand firm. And those were things that I think about that, kind of every day when I think about what I'm sort of taking lessons from Elie that are useful for today.
Are there? Thank you. I think that's 5 out. I was just wondering if there are any living people who remind you in any ways of Elie Wiesel, and any other people you've met or read or known.
So I mean, that's a really hard question. Elie was a very unique character who, and the answer is that I can't think of anyone else who might have the moral gravitas to go and have a conversation with President Trump, for example, in the same way. So no, because I mean, I'm sure there are other Holocaust survivors, and perhaps they have, but somehow Elie had a specialness to him, and he also had the fame, and he just had the credibility that was so important. So in that way, no. But of course, there are many people, and many of them not famous at all, who I've learned a huge amount from. And I think that this was another thing I've thought about. So I'm not particularly religious, but one of the things in Judaism that's really, I think a lot about is the idea of learning. It's from Pirkei Avot, which is that she or he who is wise learns from everyone. And I feel like we all need to do that. And I feel like Elie did that. He was very curious. He was a very curious person. And we have to be curious and see what we can learn from everyone. And you never know what you're going to learn when you listen. He was a good listener and he was a good speaker.
Well, Nadine Epstein, thank you for your remarks this evening, for the book, and for keeping Moment going.
Thank you for doing this, Bob.